we're back. For those of you, this is part 2. I'm Ted Lohman.
And I'm Peggy Kane.
And once again, we're off the record, and whether you got that on tape or not, I don't know. With us, once again, is our guest, Bob Dobbs. I don't know, if you haven't seen the show prior to this, I don't know how I'm going to explain it, so just stay with us, and I'm sure that you will be, what?
Well, you'll be happy that you stayed with us. You may be a little bit confused at first because we have really covered the history of the ruling families, the Illuminati, and we're working up to how the media now is controlling our lives in ways that we don't even realize, we're not even aware of. We've also learned that Bob's was born into a family that was a part of the Illuminati, that he happens to be, if you can believe this, 77 years old. And we're going to hear about that, and how extraterrestrials have played a part in all of this.
So why don't you just take it for where, you know, we've left off and go right for it and go for it.
So when the exclamation point of history happened in 1945, the atomic bomb, the effect on the Illuminati, which are the people who control the meaning of gold, the meaning of private wealth, is an interpreted medium. When you have people coming out with a sense of euphoria after World War II and feeling part of a world society, the United Nations is brought in, there's a sense of reunification. The fragmentation that money had traditionally brought in is dampened by the fact that people can have access to money on a pretty easy basis by right of citizenship. For example, the GI Bill in the United States allowed people to go to universities. So, and there's an unemployment insurance, a kind of welfare society built up. In that structure, what is the role of the Illuminati? What is the role of that traditional form of control? Well, they realized they were out of the action, so they sat on the sidelines. But culture still believed there was gold and wealth as a medium. Every medium creates a historical environment that stays there, all right? Sits there like a lump. Just like we still have newspapers, even though it's a question whether we even need them anymore. That medium stays around because they're part of the invented nature, the technological nature that humans make, and like the sun stays, our media stays. So the Illuminati sits on the sidelines and decides, since information is the means of controlling people, they realize that information is content, but they want to look at what happens when a new technology comes in and how that shakes the organization of society, alters the organization of society. So they begin to realize that they have to have surveillance on new inventions and new technologies. So they decide to build what I call the solar government, which is the satellite networks, which is a form of monitoring information that is the content of media, which is all the different cultures talking about themselves, but they're looking at new technologies and watching for them. So the solar government is monitoring the world government, and the world government is the United Nations. And on top of that, you have new cultures in the undeveloped parts of the world just getting access to literacy and access to movies. And so you have a collage effect after World War II, where the planet is, all these different cultures from different time zones of development are talking to each other. This is a chatter that accelerates through the next 40 years, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. This chatter is what I call technologies becoming conscious, because as we implode with television, then the satellite, then the computer, and then the instant replay, which confuses people's perception of what time it is, because with the instant replay, you can have the meaning before you have the experience. All right? Most perception is based on the experience and then the meaning. With the instant replay, you have the meaning before the experience. So that's an example of the confusion of cognitive processes that a new medium brings in. But the medium that comes after that, that whole chip technology we call now, is the beginning of orchestrating and converging television, movies, music, radio, all that different electric media becomes imploded into a little petri dish. So we think of genetic engineering working with our body chemistry, but think of the solar government working with the petri dish and the chip and organizing all media on a more imploded, what I call homeopathic. We're creating a hologram effect on populations, a virtual reality, but it's getting tinier and tinier like homeopathy. So it's a hologram and it's diluted, so it's homeopathic. So society becomes more involved with the tiniest bit of information that affects everybody. Now that's the general process of technology becoming conscious and taking over the role of communication.
You know, you said something that was one of those fragmenting things earlier today when you said, and I never thought of it quite like the way you explained it. You said when you're on a telephone talking to somebody, you're actually bilocating in a sense.
If you have intercom, you're quadrilocating.
And if you're reading a newspaper, it's there in front of you. You're interacting right here. It's just right here. Okay. But actually, when you are talking on a phone, you could be talking to Japan and actually, in a sense, being in Japan.
Right.
I don't know, out of the body or
it's kind of like ESP. You can make things happen 10,000 miles away.
Right.
So you're there.
You're there.
And they are here.
Now, is that an understanding that group governments and thinkers and the people that change the direction of what's going on, did they realize that at the time?
I think the Illuminati understood that. I certainly learned it early from my father. They were in a position in the 50s to see technologies and what they would do because it affected them at the most deepest level, because they had the biggest stake in power because they had it all on the sense of wealth. To them, they preserved the human race. All right, they had a sense of destiny. So they would look at the nature of this, and you take a typical intelligence person at that period, he looked at his desk, he had reports from all over the world in different languages. And then when he had telegraph and telephone, he could communicate directly. Now, the average citizen did not have that experience.
Right, right.
So the Illuminati always was living in an avant-garde frontier of experience and seeing the effects ahead of time. So that's why they could sit on the sidelines and monitor the whole world through the satellite environment. We think of the satellite as a proscenium arch around us. We visualize it. But the satellite is your telephone. It is electromagnetic. It's a membrane that implodes and has you in touch psychically with everybody when you actually use it. So the satellite is the telephone, access everywhere, but it's even expanded.
So was there ever a Cold War going on during that period of time?
The Cold War is the confusion of cultures coming in different phases of development, because military hardware, which was a medium for the last 300 years, and especially after World War I, this hardware was a market, was a particular medium. It had to be distributed. So it was farmed out to the backyards of the world, like Korea and Vietnam, where these old hardware wars were being fought. The Illuminati understood that the real warfare was the warfare caused and created by Madison Avenue, software warfare. So the biggest, World War III was a software war since World War II, since Sputnik anyways, 1957. World War III was an information war, and that was the biggest control of global cultures than any hardware war. So in that sense, the Cold War was not as important as the information war. But the Cold War was the old 19th century military hardware acting out its own evolution and being marketed off into the backyards of the world.
So where are we going? Are we leaving that behind? We're not going to go into Kosovo? We're not going to keep going with that kind of stuff where it's more information?
Other cultures will. See, that's why the American...
That's why I brought up with that. I want to try to dovetail with China now.
Right.
Bringing this China thing in, because China, in the beginning we talked about China being these people with, instead of making gunpowder for weaponry, they were making it for fireworks, and now they're bringing in a culture that has an alphabet now, right?
Right. Now, when you have the TV and satellite culture, because it brings in imagery from all over the world, as well as your local imagery, this erases the immediate local identity, all right? This caused an identity crisis for all cultures on the planet. So what you had is the undeveloped cultures like China and Japan after World War II, they feel inadequate within their cultural framework. So they want to find a new cultural framework within the larger collage and confusion of the satellite culture, the global theater, so they want to jump to the West. The West wants to jump to the East in sensibility, and the beatnik and the hippie revolutions were symptomatic of people going to Eastern right hemisphere concepts and images. Now the Japanese and Chinese thought that was absurd, and they wanted to become Western. So what did the Chinese do? A drastic move. They brought in the phonetic alphabet 20 years ago. And then they got rid of Mao. Mao was already out, but that was already part of the movement, and they bring in the anti-Gang of Four, who want a commercial society, an alphabetic society, an industrial society. So China goes west while we go east in sensibility. And so therefore China is acting out 1900. They want to have a place in the sun in industrial left hemisphere terms. Now what's ironic and satirical about it is that that culture, they cannot accomplish that because we are in an imploded society and basically a chip society, so they can only have a virtual version of the left hemisphere.
They can only go so far.
Simulation, only so far. And so at the same time as they bring in the left hemisphere activity for the peasants, the elite is getting very involved in the computer trade to the point that we want to have access to the new chips that they're developing. So you see the multi-leveled, so the world becomes a visual pun. And Finnegan's Wake is the book that shows that reality, and he wrote that out in the 30s. And the Illuminati used the Finnegan's Wake sensibility to understand and intuit the effect of the global theater.
A very close friend of mine in well, the off-the-record group here is Walter Board, and is a very close friend of yours.
Yes.
And Walter's been involved in Operation Mind Control. Now, mind control isn't something that is new. It's well, we've been talking
Every
about
culture
it.
is.
We've been talking about
yeah.
it for this whole
Yeah.
period of time, but it seemed to be there was a new language, a drug that was introduced into this whole thing in the 60s, or maybe even a little bit before, in the 50s. Talk about that.
Right.
Was it another form of communication or control or media hype in a sense?
Right. Now remember, the Illuminati sitting on the sidelines, the managers, the multinational corporations took over in the 30s. But you have these managers who are literate, almost semi-literate, because they deal with the written administration technology, but they also deal with telephones and electric media. So they're in between. So the managers come in 1945 and they want to have a world government. They call it the United Nations. At the same time, with their literate bias, they want minds to be merged and unified in this global image of a one-dimensional society. That is a natural image of society that comes out of the left hemisphere. So the industrial managers that take over after World War II, they want to control the information content of the world population. And so we are, at that point, we are so hyper-technologized and living better with chemistry, they thought that certain drugs could be used to control your central nervous system. And that was a mission that went on for 10 or 15 years into the middle 60s, where they thought they could control information. Now that, if you look at William Casey and some of those other characters, Dulles in the 50s, these people are not geniuses, but they do come out of a bureaucracy that has a sense of purpose, and they think that they want to maintain the left hemisphere structure. The Illuminati was more sophisticated. They knew that that was obsolete, but they still knew these people and had to encourage whatever sense of activity the managers was doing to give them a sense of purpose. So it gets quite confusing. The main agenda of controlling people's minds through chemistry and mind control and hypnosis is really a rearguard action when you're already controlling them through the addictive qualities of television. That they didn't know.
That is a drug in itself.
Yes.
Yes.
That they didn't know. And so MK Ultra was moved out, put to the side by the middle 60s, because by that point, after Kennedy and the charisma of that and the population and rock and roll and that whole media, that whole entertainment complex that comes in after Elvis, they saw that the population was so distracted by that any issues like going to the moon were not something that the population would want to feel involved in, because they were already traveling via television further than the
Bilocating.
bilocating.
Where does dissociative personality
Oh, okay.
come in?
Now,
Walter just said yes.
I know, I can see him.
did he? Okay, good.
Yeah.
I could hear
I'm not in trouble yet.
No.
All right. So what's interesting is that we're educated people in this sense that we've been conditioned by print education, conditioned by movie education and TV education, and now computer. Now, if you take your parents, back in the turn of the century, or your grandparents even, they